Call me crazy, but I feel that in presidential elections, whoever gets the most votes should win the election. But that isn't the case right now. A lot of this has to do with the Electoral College, and this is why I personally support abolishing the Electoral College and determining presidential elections by the popular vote. I feel that in the United States, it shouldn't matter where you live, every vote should be equal. There have been 5 presidential elections in our history where the winner of the election actually didn't win the popular vote. All of the challengers of the elections either won a majority or a plurality of votes. They all had significant money behind their campaigns, and they all had strong support from a lot of Americans. So why didn't they become president? A good example of this is the 2000 election, where Vice President Al Gore lost to Governor George W. Bush by about 537 votes in the state of Florida. Now, whether or not Gore would have been a great president or not is debatable, but still, one would have to acknowledge that it isn't fair that he lost this election by such a small margin in the Electoral College, despite his popular vote victory margin being about 0.51%, which is on par with some presidents who actually succeeded in their attempts to become president, such as John F. Kennedy in 1960 and President Richard Nixon in 1968. In 2016, Gore actually supported eliminating the Electoral College, saying it would stimulate public participation in the democratic process like nothing else we could possibly do. In my speech, I will discuss the history of the Electoral College and why it's rooted in racism. I'll discuss all the counter-arguments to keeping the Electoral College and why I feel that they're invalid. And finally, I'll discuss the benefits we could see from an elimination of the Electoral College. The Electoral College was developed by the Founding Fathers and is part of the United States Constitution. Even from its conception, it was rooted in racism. In the South, there was large slave populations, and slaves weren't seen as people. So what happened was the 3/5 compromise, where for every 5 slaves, only 3 of them were counted as part of the population. The Electoral College was also developed because many had contempt for the average American, and they felt they weren't intelligent enough to elect a president through a normal popular vote contest. We should all reject this contempt, and we should all acknowledge that the country has changed since then. Women are allowed to vote now, African Americans are allowed to vote now, but the way we elect our president hasn't changed, and it's important that we evolve if we want our country to survive. Under the Electoral College, people do not directly elect their president. A good example of this is the 1960 election, where in Mississippi, Alabama, and Oklahoma, there were faithless electors that refused to vote for Richard Nixon or John F. Kennedy, so they voted for Senator Harry Byrd. While it's unlikely, faithless electors do present the possibility of victory being stolen from someone who would otherwise win the popular vote in the Electoral College by faithless electors dragging their feet on a certain candidate. And if the 1960 election were closer, it's possible that President John F. Kennedy's victory would have been stolen away from him, and Richard Nixon would have become the 35th President of the United States. Each state's electors are determined by the population in the state. Since every state has at least 2 senators and 1 congressman, every state is guaranteed at least 3 Electoral College votes. This in itself is somewhat unfair because it overrepresents states with extremely small populations. A good example of this is a state like Wyoming, which has about 500 to 600,000 people in its state. California, on the other hand, has about 40 million people in the state. So California has roughly 70 times the population of Wyoming, but Wyoming still has 3 Electoral College votes compared to California's 55. If it were more fair, because currently California has only 20 times the representation of Wyoming, despite having such a large gap. This isn't fair to people in California, and it's also not fair to people in other highly populated states like Florida, Texas, and New York. The Electoral College also opens the door to unfair preferential treatment in certain recounts. Going back to the 2000 election in Florida, Governor Jeb Bush was actually George W. Bush's brother. He was also a member of the same party, the Republican Party, and he obviously had a preference for Bush. So the recount was extremely controversial and was ultimately decided by the Supreme Court in the Bush versus Gore decision that awarded George W. Bush all the electors from Florida, and it gave him the 271 votes necessary, 1 more necessary to become elected president. If it wasn't for Bush's lackluster recount in Florida, it's possible and actually very likely that Al Gore actually did receive the most votes in Florida, and that under different circumstances he could have won the Electoral College and become the 43rd President of the United States. The winner-take-all system in the Electoral College is also flawed because it could lead to bad hypothetical situations. A good example of this is 2016, where Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 3 million votes, but Mr. Donald Trump won the Electoral College by about 304 votes. Regardless of your opinions of Mr. Trump or Mrs. Clinton, 2016 did propose a disturbing new trend where the Electoral College and the popular vote have actually been severed because Democrats amassed such a large amount of votes in states like California and New York, and there's no red state to offset that balance. So it's one of the reasons and one of the main design flaws of the Electoral College. Many are actually still in favor of the Electoral College, and there's many arguments to be made in its favor. Some say that the Electoral College is good because if the popular vote was determining elections, only a handful of states would decide the election. This is invalid because this is already the case with the Electoral College. Going back to 2016, Donald Trump won the election mainly because he got the most votes in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Now, if Hillary Clinton had won the Rust Belt, she would have won the election. And the upcoming election is going to be determined by a lot of these swing states that I previously mentioned, as well as states like Florida and Arizona and Ohio. It's also bad for voter turnout because when there's a state with a certain partisan lean that's guaranteed to go a certain direction during presidential elections, voters are a lot less likely to turn out, and this is bad for the democratic process. Some say the Electoral College unifies the country and provides small states more representation. This is also invalid because it does so at the consequence of other states, like I mentioned with California. This also empowers certain voters while harming and actually diminishing votes from others. Eliminating the Electoral College could be a very good thing because it could actually increase voter turnout. Like I said, this is very good for the democratic process. Voters would have equal representation, and regardless of what state you live in, your vote would matter just as much as anyone else. There would also be no preferential lean where some states like Wyoming or other low population states like North Dakota and South Dakota wouldn't have such a huge influence on the election, and the election would actually be more fair. Faithless electors also pose an issue of diminishing votes because they can choose a different candidate. Even in 2016, there were 7 electoral faithless electors. Now, the election was won by a decent enough margin to where it didn't change the outcome of the election, but it still was certainly a possibility. In conclusion, support for abolishment of the Electoral College has grown. As I said earlier, Al Gore has come out in support of it, and Hillary Clinton in 2016 actually supported it, saying, "We've moved toward one person, one vote." Both of these people, of course, lost their runs for president because of the Electoral College. Other prominent Democrats, such as Senator Elizabeth Warren, Congressman Beto O'Rourke, and Mayor Pete Buttigieg, have also supported abolishing it. Even Donald Trump in 2012 supported it, saying the Electoral College is a disaster for democracy. This, of course, was 4 years before he was elected President of the United States. We need a system that benefits everyone, and not just certain voters in these smaller states. Unfortunately, like everything in our country, the Electoral College has become a political issue, but that shouldn't be the case. The Electoral College benefits rural voters over urban ones, and the reasons for the creation of the Electoral College no longer stand. In fact, they never stood. It's been rooted in racism and contempt for the American people, and the country has changed, and so should the way we elect our president. Votes are no longer equal, and we need to abolish the Electoral College for fairness and for voter turnout. As I've said before, whoever you vote for, it shouldn't matter where you live. Everyone is equal in my eyes. Every single vote should be equal, and we should no longer have preferential treatment in our elections.